Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel deck profile. Today we're taking a look at the new Psychic Fusion deck and our new, big boss monster, Candy Live. So this deck's pretty cool. There are a few different ways you can build it. This version is the one that's worked the best for me so far. This is kind of a bit more well-rounded, a bit more of an all-rounder version. The other one plays a lot more copies of Fusion and Star Restart and basically plays like Fusion Turbo. And this is one of the more complex decks of the new meta, and I feel like because of that there will be a bunch of different ways to build this deck, and we might not have a solidified what is the best list for a couple of weeks. But first things first, let's get into the skill. Infinite D Live. So requirement can be activated from turn 2 onwards if all of the monsters in your constructed deck are psychic type monsters. Multi-choice effect. So either we send a light or dark attribute monster with 100, 400, 1500 or 2200 attack from your deck to the graveyard. So this lets you send Prima-Gatana to the graveyard. It will let you send Candy to the graveyard. They're going to be the primary ones we're going to be going for. We can also send one of our 1500 vanillas to the graveyard. That is an option. And then the only other cards we could send to the graveyard would be Amalilith and Speedy Performer. Now, we're not playing Amalilith or Speedy Performer, but we do have access to all the rest of those cards, so we can dump those into the graveyard. Again, the ones we're primarily going to be dumping is going to be Prima-Gatana and Candy. The other effect is that we can send one card from our hand to the graveyard, then add a Psychic Upper, Ice Pot Bear, or Fusion from your deck or graveyard to your hand, but each card only once per duel. So we do have to discard a card to use this. That's probably the worst part of this. Only being able to search each card once per duel does also kind of suck, especially because we can only search Fusion once per duel. Because a lot of the Fusion skills will let you infinitely get back Fusion, so you only actually have to run the one copy. This skill is not like those. This is a lot more similar to the Cyber Dragon skill, where we have to play more than one if we realistically want to be fusing more than once. But this skill is pretty good because we can get hold of a Psychic Up, which is half of our Fusion. We can grab Ice Pot Bear, which represents either one or two bodies, and if we already have Fusion, can be a Fusion on its own. Or we could grab Fusion, which is, again, required to make a Fusion. So I think the best place to start is actually going to be our boss monster itself, the Candy Live. So this is made using Candy and Psychic Upper. So if your opponent has a monster on their field, so we can't just do this on like turn 1, for example, we can either take 2000 damage, which is a lot, but make all face-up monsters on your opponent's field lose 3000 attack until the end of this turn. So this effectively will set all of your opponent's monsters' attack to 0, which is really good and can lead to some very powerful OTKs. Very, very powerful effect, again, has a very, very steep cost. And then the other effect, which is actually the one we end up using a lot more often, is gain 1000 life points, and then we can choose a level 7 or higher psychic monster in our graveyard and special summon it to our field. Now, the only monster that we could ever summon with this effect in this build is Prima-Gatana. So if we can use our skill quite early to send Prima-Gatana to the graveyard, on a later turn make Candy Live, we can then bring Prima back, and basically every time in the future we then make a Candy Live, we will just keep bringing Prima back again and again and again. And then we can either gain that 1000 life points and then immediately spend it on Prima-Gatana's effect, or we can just gain that 1000 and sit on it. Either way is pretty good. So Candy Live, absolutely fantastic boss monster. It's really good early in the game because we can gain life points, we can build a very big board very easily, and we can apply a bit of pressure, and a very, very strong finisher because if we know our opponent's back row is dead, or if we just kind of have to go for a long shot play, we can reduce all our opponent's monsters' attack and attack in. But you cannot use both these effects on the same turn, which means getting Prima-Gatana out at the same time as Candy Live can be a bit difficult. Since we're already on the fusions, we'll talk about the other one briefly. This is Candy. Oh, brand new card made using Candy and Ice Pot Bear. Ice Pot Bear, again, can get you back Candy. So basically, Ice Pot Bear plus Fusion gets you a Candy. Oh, but its effect is we can special summon one level 6 or lower Psychic type monster from your graveyard face up to your field. So this is okay. A lot of the time, we'll be using this to get Psychic Upper because that's going to be probably the best option. But we don't really want to grab Psychic Upper unless we have a spare copy of Fusion or the Star Restart to basically make a second Fusion, because Psychic Upper on its own doesn't really do much. But if we do have access to multiple Fusions, getting this out and then basically using this to leapfrog into Psychic Upper and then get into Candy Live can be really, really strong. So, Prima-Gatana, the Shining Superstar. This is basically a Garnet. We really don't want to be drawing this. If we do draw it, it's still not the end of the world. We can get it into the graveyard by using our skill. But then we have to commit to searching out one of the 3 cards that we can search with our skill from our deck, and we might not want them in our hand immediately, so this can get a little bit awkward. In general, we don't really want to draw into this unless we're already set up, because we'd rather send this to the graveyard using the skill. but we can pay 1,000 life points. All face-up monsters on your field gain attack equal to the number of monsters in your opponent's field times 300, which is really good. Then we have Roman Pick. We still only have one copy of this card, otherwise we would be playing more. This card actually doesn't come up too often, but when it does, it's very, very impactful. The reason being we are usually at higher life total than our opponents. But if our life points are lower than our opponents, we can pay 500 life points, send the top 3 cards of a deck to the graveyard, then if a psychic monster is among the cards sent, add a psychic monster from your graveyard to your hand. So this is just fantastic. We fuel the graveyard, we're going to want things like Prima Katana in there, we're going to want Candy in there, we're going to want lots of monsters in there to get effects like Jump Start and things like Pot of Avarice going, so there is a need to get those cards in there, but being able to get any psychic monster out of your graveyard is really, really good. We can grab half of our fusion, we can grab Candy if we have, for example, a Jump Check, we want to gain the life points, we can grab Ice Pot Bear, which represents Ice Pot Bear and Candy, we can grab Rhythmical Performer if we just need a Hail Mary draw, we can grab Magical Miracle if we really need that. There's just so much we can do with Roman Pick, it's a no-brainer to include. Then we have Psychic Upper. This card also pretty good. Now, the only downside about this card is it's level 6. We are going to have to tribute to get it out. But during the turn that we summon it, we can lower its attack by 800 and gain 800 life points. So what we will almost always do is slap this down, use its effect, mill one card, gain 800 life points, fuse into our Candy Live, then use its effect to gain another 1,000, and we've just gained 1,800 life points, which is really, really good. Being able to basically start the game on almost 8,000 life points is really strong. Then we have Magical Miracle, and this one's a bit of a suspect inclusion. I see a lot of people ask me questions like, why are we including this card? Well, the logic behind Magical Miracle as 2 copies of our limit 3 is because this allows us to OTK relatively consistently. So if we can, for example, get the Prima Katana into the graveyard, then we can summon out the Candy and the Magical Miracle. We can Magical Miracle to bring back the Prima Katana. Then if we're able to stick a Psychic Upper and fuse into the Candy Live, effectively we don't now have to bring back Prima with the plus 1,000 effect, which means we can use the minus 2,000 effect, so minus 2,000 of our life points, to weaken our opponent's board all down to 0. And then if they have just 2 attack position monsters, but 3 monsters in total, Prima Katana's effect activates, we pay another 1,000, both of our monsters gain 900 attack, and so Prima becomes 31, and Candy Live becomes 37, attack over 2 0 attack monsters, and that is just game. So if we're able to basically get all of that, and it does sound like a lot of moving pieces, but it does actually come off more than you might think, especially when we have Jump Check to basically all but guarantee we're going to land this. It's not always going to be the case, but it does make it a lot more likely, as well as all the life gain we have in here does make it quite likely we'll be able to pay the 3,000 to make this combo work. That's why I really like Magical Miracle. Also, it does come up where if we just don't have access to our fusions, we can just summon out a Candy, get Magical Miracle, go into Prima, summon out, let's say, a 1,500 vanilla, and then just use Prima to boost up our whole board and attack over our opponent's board. If they've got something particularly dangerous that we have to get rid of, we cannot just ignore it, like a Metarion Fusion, for example. This can be a necessary evil to get you out of a tight jam, even though it does mean leaving a Candy face up. Next up, Rhythmical Performer. Again, milling is always really good, and we are in a meta right now where a lot of decks are playing a lot more spell traps, so this is more likely to come off. It does also have 900 defense, which is quite nice into a lot of the piercing decks we've had going around, and there are quite a few of them, so it's not bad for that. I usually wouldn't summon this card face up unless we're obviously going to be tributing it off, or if we need a Hail Mary draw because we literally have nothing, we're going to die to piercing on the next turn anyway, but still very strong card. Then we have the 1 copy of Ice Pot Bear. We have the 1 because we can search this, and we have multiple ways to put it back into our deck with effects like Jump Start and effects like Pot of Avarice. So usually this will be live. We can just put it back into our deck and have access to it, even if it gets sent to the graveyard early. But being able to, again, get back Candy can be really good because we can summon this, get back the Candy, then tribute it off to get out the Psychic Upper. Then we already have the Candy and the Psychic Upper online, which is pretty good. Now, this version of the deck doesn't get as much value from Ice Pot Bear because we're not spamming out fusion, so Candy All is not as useful, and we don't have that many tribute monsters, or at least double tributes. We're only playing the Prima Katana, and ideally we're going to put that into the graveyard as soon as possible. So having the 2 bodies off of just the summon of Ice Pot Bear, not as useful, but still really good. Then there's Candy, basically the star of the deck. This is half of both of our fusions. This can obviously get summoned off of Ice Pot Bear. It can get to our hand using Jump Start and gain us some life points. Jump Check, again, gains us more life points, and we want to have the normal monsters so that Jump Check is live. It's just really, really good. Then we have 1 Peace Holder and 3 Silent Assailant. We're only on the 1 Peace Holder because it's light, and right now Dark Galaxy can get small boosts if we have light monsters, so we just want as few lights as possible, but we did want the 4 1500 attackers, and they do come up. Especially against a deck like Dark Galaxy, which just has a ton of piercing, we just slap these in attack mode because we don't want them in defense, and Dark Galaxy doesn't have a ton of ways to change you to defense. For the most part, it's just going to be Elysium, and that is quite a heavy cost, so they won't do it most of the time. For our legend spell, we've gone Pot of Avarice. I really like this card. This is effectively a combo deck, and because of that, the more cards we have access to, the more things we can do. So just having Pot of Avarice is really, really good, as well as the fact we can throw a load of cards back into our deck. And since our deck does effectively search out 2 different monsters, we are quite happy to do that. We could even, for example, put the Prima-Gitana back into our deck and then just put it back in the graveyard later if we desperately need those extra cards to have a play. So Pot of Avarice, in my opinion, is probably the best one for Psychic, but any of the other legend cards would also work fine. Pot of Avarice is just what I prefer in this build. Then we have just the 1 copy of Starry Star, and this is just because we want to make sure we have enough normal summons, and already we don't have as many as we would like. So we want more Starry Star if we could, and more copies of Fusion, but something has to give, right? We can't have absolutely everything in this deck. We could go up to like 35, 40 cards maybe, but then that makes the consistency go out of whack, just to make the ratios better. So for now, we're only playing the 1 Starry Star, and this has worked out quite well for us so far. And we have 2 copies of Fusion. This is the same ratio that Cyber Dragon uses in their 30 card build with basically a similar skill, and it does work quite well in here. There have been a few times we've been like, we just really need to get our Fusion online, and in that regard, it has held us back only having the 2 and 1 copy of Starry Star, but this is the build that I've had the most success with and has been the most enjoyable for me so far. Then Jamp Check. This card is still absolutely broken. This card absolutely deserves to be Limit 2. It is actually insane. This card is almost always live. It's extremely rare that it's not. And being able to pop one of 2 cards that you get to look at is insanely powerful, as well as we will almost always gain that 1000 life points, which is unbelievably good. This is probably the best card in the deck and deservedly is at Limit 2. Then we have Jamp Start, again, another fantastic card. Put cards back into our deck, that's something we really want. We can grab back Candy, which is what we'll grab back almost all the time. Gaining those life points is very, very important. This deck sometimes will go as high as 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 life points if we're allowed to get our game plan going. So just having access to half of our Fusion, as well as the 1000 life points, and sometimes this will represent 2,000 because we can get a Jamp Check as well. So just really, really powerful card. Probably the most cuttable card, but I personally really like this for just the massive amount of life point gain and consistency. Especially since our skill will send Candy to the graveyard as well, so we can make sure this card is almost always live. And then for the traps, our first one, Rice Terrace Crisis. This card is very, very strong. I would say this card feels weakest against, at the moment in this meta, against probably Metarion, just because they kind of have to missequence their plays and will only get this effect off on a Star Restart play. Now, it still is useful. It still can be really good, but it comes up a lot less often against that deck, whereas both Galaxy decks, for example, and Cyber Dragon, it works so well against those, and is just one of the key cards in the deck for dealing with those matchups. And it's one of the reasons that I actually think this deck doesn't have a fantastic matchup into Metarion, but we'll get into that when we talk about the matchups. Then we have Buffeted Slime. Again, this card is good and really, really good into just about everything except Metarion. Metarion, Buffeted Slime still can gain value, but not as much as it would against a lot of the other decks. Buffeted Slime still an absolutely fantastic trap, and I would say it's a necessity with the amount of Cyber Dragon, Dark Galaxy, Light Galaxy we have going around, but again, does feel weak into Metarion. Then we have Widespread Ruin, and this card is almost the opposite. So this is actually quite good against Dark Galaxy, although Dark Galaxy can boost up their Requiem and then not use their Elysium effect, so they won't get to play around it as often. But Light Galaxy can just slap down Secret Order and then grab a monster that's immune to traps, and that does come up occasionally. Also, Widespread Ruin feels really bad into Ancient Gig Golem, because they will attack with the Ancient Gig Golem first, then they'll attack with something else, and then we can flip over Widespread, but now we're going to destroy the monster that's already attacked, so it does feel quite bad in that regard. But Widespread Ruin is still absolutely fantastic. This card can completely shift the tempo of a game and can create really big comebacks in situations where it would feel quite dire. We can just win entirely off the back of Widespread Ruin. And last but not least, we have Card Restoration. This is just a really good trap card. Like we were saying before, having access to more cards is generally quite good. Again, if we were going to cut something, it would probably be the Restoration, but I really like the way this card works. Being able to start your turn with 6 cards is really good. Gaining life points, again, is really good. This does actually work against Metarion and other fusion monsters and can save us and has saved us in the past, which is just really good. I personally am a big fan of card restoration, but I know a lot of other people aren't, and I wouldn't blame you for not liking this card. And I think if there was any room to cut anything, it would probably be the restoration, Jumpstart, and maybe Peaceholder. But how does the deck play? The deck actually feels really good. It is a little bit inconsistent in that we can use the skill to gain access to one of the 3 cards we need for our fusion, that being Psychic Upper, the Candy, and Fusion itself, but that still means we have to naturally draw into the other 2 pieces, which can get a little bit frustrating on occasion. When, though, everything does fall into place, the deck feels very, very strong. We're able to gain so many life points that, for example, we have been in so many situations where we've been at like 12,000 life points and we've been basically had no threat of death, and the only way we possibly die was like type change being double Ashura Star to get to like ridiculous attack. Spoilers, that might be how one of the replays goes. But a lot of the time you feel so safe just having so many life points, and that's one of the really fun ways to play this deck. On top of the fact that, again, this deck does have insane OTK potential. A lot of the time, in order to combat your ridiculously high amount of life points, your opponent has to hard commit a lot of monsters to the board, and then we can punish them with Candy Life's first effect, especially if we get to use Jump Check to clear the back row beforehand. So very powerful control-y style where we can just keep replacing big bodies on the field, keep increasing our life points, keep just chipping away at our opponent, but then we can kind of switch into a very aggressive play when we want to use Candy Life to try and finish off our opponent, and we can finish them off from quite a few life points. We talked already before about the Prima-Gatana and Candy Life combo, which can easily do 6,000 damage, but if we just have another monster, that could easily represent another 2,000 to 3,000 damage, so we could kill from up to 9,000, which is just completely bonkers. As for matchups, I actually think this deck has really strong matchups into a lot of the meta right now. I think the worst matchup is probably Metarion, and that is almost entirely because of Type Change Beam. If Type Change Beam wasn't an issue, I think this deck even has quite a strong matchup into Metarion. I personally, again, mileage may vary, right? My experience might not be the same as everyone else's, but I have played this a lot on ladder, I have taken this to tournaments, I have taken this to point battles, and in my experience, we basically just farm Dark Galaxy. It's been pretty free for me. We've pretty much had really strong matchups into Cyber Dragon, outside of like some misclick and bricking. Again, we're not like completely undefeated against those decks, but the games that we have lost was primarily due to like unplayable hands of either just complete spell traps or just monsters we can't summon. So other than those, this deck actually does seem really strong right now, and I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being one of the stronger decks in the meta after the first week or two and things have sort of calmed down about and the meta has somewhat solidified. But let's fire into some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.
did it!